Howdy, howdy, y'all. Thank you again for stopping by on the channel. Today we'll be taking a look at this Seiko model, reference SUN049. It's a part of Seiko's Prospex series, and within that, their Kinetic line. This one, though, features a GMT function, which is actually a true GMT, which I'll go over in just a few moments here. And I'll go over some of the basics of the watch in this video. I'll go over a bit of history and then some of the dimensions. And then at the very end, I'll be sure to give it my own personal score and where I would consider this watch to rank in some other ones we've seen so far on the channel. So to jump into the history of this watch, uh, Seiko first initially came out with a prototype of their Kinetic series back in 1986 during the Basel event. At that time, Seiko considered it and called it the automatic quartz. And in 1988, so just about 2 years after that, Seiko were to release their first commercial model known as the AGS. Some of you might have seen that model or other models before. AGS stands for Automatic Generating System, and it was a very early inception of the kinetic technology that would later advance to what we're seeing today. But in 1991, the Seiko company decided to rebrand the name AGS to the Kinetic, and it has since stuck with this particular kind of movement. And those who aren't familiar with the Seiko kinetic movements, it works in a very similar way to an automatic movement. It's a bit of a hybrid between a quartz watch and a mechanical in the sense that with this one, you have a rotor in the back that helps generate electricity. And instead of that energy being transferred into a mainspring, what you have is that energy built up by the rotor being transferred into a capacitor. Now, for this model, the capacitor lasts up to 6 months, so you basically have a battery powered kinetic haha, sense of a watch where as long as you keep it moving, the watch will keep running and will work as a quartz watch. So with this watch in particular, it is a bit of a larger sized kinetic than most other Seiko Kinetic watches out there. And to go over exactly how big it is, the case itself wears large at 50 millimeters, but with this particular bracelet, it does have a larger effective wearing sense because you do have these two link ends right here that protrude just a little bit further out in the case, giving you an effective 54 millimeters of wearing capability. The thickness of the watch is 14.5 millimeters, with the size of it across, including the crown, being at 49 millimeters and a lug width of 24. There are some other options of this particular model that don't come with a bracelet. They do have a leather strap instead. So if you don't want to be rocking a 54 millimeter watch but feel more comfortable with a 50, then maybe a strap option would be better, whether you want to get it on the bracelet and take it off or go for one of those strap models instead. But for the most part, the case itself, yes, again, is large, but it does have some pretty nice angularity to it. You can see on the sides here you have high polish, and then on the flanks right here you can see a little bit of a contour polish that's done, also in high polish though, but it does run the length of the case on both sides. That does give it a very nice and a little bit of a different appearance than just being a broad, flat shaped case. And then on the very top of the hoods for each lugs, you can see that it's done in a matte finish. You also have a very similar thing with the bracelet as well. You have high polish on the center links down actually towards the bottom, while the rest of it will be done in a matte finish. And if you're familiar with other Seikos that come with a folding bracelet, simple double deployant with a clamshell and stamped clasp. On here, you have 4 points of micro adjust, so if you do need to take out some of the links and get a more perfect fit, it allows you to do so. And held together by pins and collars, Seiko's, well, more or less only way of really doing bracelets. And they are solid links, so it does have a bit of a nicer feel to it, though it does make the watch feel more heavy overall. But kind of moving on more towards the watch itself, you can see you have a crown, and this button right here, for those who are unfamiliar, is an on-demand power reserve indicator. So the power reserve indicator will be read by the seconds hand here, and it gives you a 30-second display of how much power you have on the watch. So once we get to that 30-second mark, I'll hit it, and you can see it gets to the 5 right there. So basically what that is telling me is that the watch has a little bit of power reserve, but it doesn't have the 6 months that these are rated for. If it does have a higher power reserve, you'll see the seconds hand move somewhere, anywhere in that 30 basically second counter. So if I had a 6 month, it hit it here. But you don't have to exactly do it at the 30-second mark. You can do it really kind of wherever, as I can demonstrate once more. Once it hits the 5 to make it a little bit easier, you'll see that it'll jump to the 10 position there. But if it was completely filled, you'd see it bounce all the way over here to the 35 position. So it acts as a really nice, again, on-demand power reserve indicator to let you know how much energy you have left in the watch. Once the power reserve gets low, you'll see that the seconds hand would do a little bit of an end-of-life indicator where it'll bounce every other second and give you an idea that, hey, give me a bit of shake or give me some charge and keep me going for a little bit longer. Once we start moving into the dial, we're actually going to focus more on the bezel before, and we're going to see that the bezel on here is a compass style bezel. It does have 4 points of gripping, so if you need to get a handle on it, you can do so. It is friction fit. It does feel pretty nice, a little bit of resistance, but no ratcheting the same way you would with the dive bezel. And what's nice about here that I enjoy is different contrast for the way the bezel is designed. You have this high gloss finish on the outer portion. On the very top right here, you have it done in this nice matte relief. And then on the very inner part right here, where you kind of see the southwest, northwest, northeast portions, it's done in that high gloss again. So you don't have this full high gloss look shining back at you when you're viewing the watch. You can kind of have a bit more readability on the very top due to it being of a matte finish. Once we move into the dial now, we can see that the dial is what I would consider Seiko to call it black. It's kind of a very, very dark gray and very bright lighting, but we'll call it black for now. And you can see that it does have some pretty nice applied indices. All of them are lume filled. However, each of the indices has a border done in high gloss, so you do have a bit of reflection coming back at you when you're looking down at the dial. Very nice accent of red for the GMT hand. You might notice that the GMT hand and the hour and minute hands are fully skeletonized with little bits of lume at the very tip. So it makes reading it a little bit more difficult at night, but because there's so much lume that's on there in terms of how much, I guess, space there is to fill, it actually does make it a little bit easier to read. So even though they're skeletonized, they are still somewhat easy to read at night and at a glance as well because of how much space they take up on the dial. The seconds hand itself is actually done in high polish, so it's not too bad. It does add a bit more reflectivity during highlight situations, but it's still not terrible. Date at the 4:30 position here, and the movement itself is the 5M85A, again with a 6-month power reserve, so if you do need to get it charged up, you have up to 6 months that you can keep this watch running for without really any issue. And one thing I do like about this watch as well, as I mentioned previously, is that it's a true GMT, meaning that the seconds, or not the seconds, but the local hour hand can move independently of the GMT hand. And you might notice I'm going backwards on here, and that's fine because you can actually set the date forward or backwards by doing so. And it's not a quick set by that regard. It would be just a local hour change you might see on some other higher end models outside of the Seiko company. But you can advance the date forwards or backwards and skip around time zones that you need to with the use of that local hour hand. If you do need to set the time to a specific point, pull the crown out all the way and you'll be able to set the time and go a bit forward from there. Once you get the time that you want to go for, press the crown back in. About 2 screws to get the watch fully seated back into place, or get the crown fully seated back into place. And it is pretty grippy, as you do have these larger knurled bits on the side, so you can get a good grasp on it if you need to get your fingers on the crown. It is a bit smaller though, so with gloves it might be a bit more difficult, but still it's there, and I think it works fairly well for its size. But again, the loom plots on here look pretty nice, especially in the dark, and we'll take a look at them right now. So looking at the watch here in the dark, you can see that the loom is fairly well applied on all of the indices and hands. The hands, because they are skeletonized, you do get only little bits, but they are large enough to actually recognize and see in the dark, so you can get a pretty good bearing of exactly what time it is, while also being able to read that GMT hand on the fly as well. The indices are fairly large too, and you do have that 12 o'clock indice giving you a bit of a cutout, almost like an A design, that allows you to get your orientation in case you do have this watch sitting in the dark. And another aspect that I enjoy about the watch is the compass layout. The design of it reminds me of a compass rose. You have like the north, south, east, west portions with these little stick indices there to kind of highlight the directionality a little bit more. But I do think it looks fairly well. Again, applied, and so is the Seiko moniker there at 12. The Prospex Kinetic GMT is stamped there, and as you might see on the dial, 100 meters of water resistance, so it's there and you can get it wet a little bit, but don't take it diving really anytime soon. And moving on to the Caseback, there's really nothing too special about it. I mean, it's an exhibition Caseback, so you do see the kinetic movement inside, again, the 5M85A, but really, unless you're a fan of seeing coils and the capacitor and rotor, it's really nothing special, to be honest. I think that would have been a better execution if Seiko did a closed case back with a Seiko Prospex logo like this, um, instead of doing this uh, exhibition case back into a relatively, I'd argue, boring movement. But for the most part, if you enjoy it, great. Though I don't think most people will. But it's there nonetheless, so take it as it is. And now we'll move on to the very last bit of it and give my personal score about the watch overall and, well, see how it compares to some of the watches that I've reviewed so far on the channel. In terms of comfortability, I personally think the watch is actually wearing fairly well. It is again a large watch, so not everyone will find it to be comfortable, but for myself, I think it's fairly moderate. I give it a 5 out of 10. It wears just large enough in my opinion that it doesn't look too large or like really overhang itself, but there's no doubt that you're wearing a heavy watch when you have this on the wrist, and you won't really have that experience of feeling like you're not wearing something on your wrist. You will remember that this watch is on your wrist when you do put it on. The design of it, I think, is fairly well also. The dial on here, again, reminiscent of a compass design, and I really love that small attention to detail. And I think the overall look of it is fairly well. I give it a 6 out of 10. Legibility, I think, is excellent because you have such an expansive dial. You get tons of room to read exactly what the GMT hand is and whatever the local hour hand is. So overall, I think it is a 7 out of 10 because, well, I think it's very easy to read. For recommendability, I don't really think it would do too well in comparison to some other watches, but for what it is, I think it's a 5 out of 10. I'd recommend it to some people if they're looking for a rough and tumble watch, but maybe nothing that they're going to be wearing all the time. Quality, I think, is there. As I just said, rough and tumble. It definitely has that feeling of it can take a beating and keep on going. And for the most part, I give it an 8 out of 10. For flexibility, or for what others might perceive the watch to really be, I don't think it's that high. It's a quartz watch at the end of the day. There's nothing too special about it besides the um, bezel compass and the fact that it's a true GMT Seiko, but for the most part, I give it a 4 out of 10. Not terribly high, but also nowhere near the worst. So for the total of it would come out to about 35 out of 60. Put it in good company with some other watches that I've seen on the channel, and hopefully we'll see a few more like it in the future and maybe some better ones along the way. But for the most part, I do want to thank you for stopping by and checking out this video. I'll catch you all in the next one.